The chandelier lights sparkled against the gold-trimmed walls of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, setting the stage for one of Hollywood's most prestigious events. Expensive suits, dazzling evening gowns, and glasses of champagne created an atmosphere of sheer luxury. Guests moved between tables, exchanging carefully polished pleasantries, but no one forgot the true purpose of the night: to raise funds for mental health support for veterans. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. No entourage, no announcement, no fanfare, just a simple black suit, hands casually tucked into his pockets, his presence commanding attention without a single word. Conversations hushed as people noticed him. Some whispered among themselves, a few turned their heads, but no one rushed up to beg for an autograph or excessively fawn over him. They simply stood there, acknowledging him for what he was, a legend. Clint made his way to the bar, shaking hands with a few old friends, exchanging words with the veterans in attendance. He was not one for idle chatter, but when he spoke, people felt heard. In a Hollywood world filled with glitz and pretense, Clint was one of the few who carried authenticity. He didn't need to impress anyone, because he was the impression. And from across the room, Brandon Keller was watching. A young journalist with sharp eyes and a calculating smile. He saw Clint as an opportunity, a chance to make a statement, but what he didn't realize was that he was about to enter a battle he had no chance of winning. Brandon Keller tightened his grip on his phone, his gaze locked onto Clint Eastwood. He wasn't a movie star, but he was an up-and-coming name in journalism, particularly in the industry of takedowns, exposing and dismantling figures he deemed past their prime. He had built his career writing about Hollywood's outdated icons, those he considered relics of a bygone era, clinging to relevance. And tonight, Clint Eastwood was the perfect target. In Keller's mind, everything was already set. A confrontation, a viral moment, a video that would spread like wildfire across social media. The night would end with Clint Eastwood looking flustered, backed into a corner, reduced to an outdated joke for a new generation. But he had forgotten one crucial thing. Clint Eastwood wasn't an easy man to corner. Keller adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and strode confidently across the dance floor, heading straight for the bar. No one stopped him, but the air around him shifted. Conversations began to die down, eyes subtly turning in his direction. No one knew exactly what was about to happen, but they felt the tension in the air. Clint was still listening to a veteran share a story, a faint smile crossing his lips as he nodded in acknowledgement. He didn't notice Keller, or rather, he didn't care. Brandon stopped just a step away from Clint, pausing briefly before speaking, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Mr. Eastwood, may I ask you a few questions?" Clint slowly lifted his glass, took a sip, then turned to face him. He didn't speak. He didn't nod or frown. He simply looked at him, his cold, unwavering gaze assessing whether this conversation was worth his time. Brandon didn't waver. He stepped closer, raising his phone, not bothering to ask for permission. He didn't need Clint's approval, he just needed to start. "I just want to know, do you think people like you still have a place in Hollywood?" And just like that, the battle began. Brandon Keller wasn't inexperienced. He knew how to turn an interview into a confrontation, how to escalate a conversation into a clash of ideologies, and now he stood before Clint Eastwood, phone raised, his half-smirk filled with self-assurance. "I just want to know, do you think people like you still have a place in Hollywood?" The question wasn't random, it was crafted, designed for maximum effect, meant to provoke a reaction, defensiveness, anger, or perhaps a moment of hesitation. A single line that could be edited, stripped of context, turned into a headline. But Clint Eastwood wasn't a man who played by anyone's rules. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he lifted his glass again, took another sip, and studied Brandon like a man who had seen 1,000 versions of him before. The room around them grew quieter. Conversations began to fade. Heads turned, eyes locked onto the scene unfolding at the bar. "People like me?" Clint's voice was slow, measured, but carried the weight of a lifetime. "What exactly do you mean by that, kid?" Brandon smirked, lifting his chin slightly. I mean your generation, your outdated views, your old-fashioned mindset. Hollywood has changed. The world has changed. Do you really think you still belong? A tense silence settled over the room. A few guests exchanged quick glances, sensing that Keller was trying to put Clint on the spot. But those who knew Clint Eastwood understood one thing. Keller had just made a terrible mistake. Clint set his glass down, his fingers tapping lightly against the bar. Then, slowly, he raised his head, locking eyes with Keller. A stare that could make even the toughest men falter. You rehearsed that line in front of a mirror, didn't you? A low rumble of laughter spread around the bar. A few people chuckled openly. Keller hesitated, his expression darkening slightly. But Clint wasn't finished. Let me tell you something, kid, he said, his voice steady, carrying the weight of decades. The world doesn't change just because some guy waves his hand and declares it so. The game had just begun. Brandon Keller couldn't believe it. His plan was slipping off course. He had come here to put Clint Eastwood on the defensive, but instead, it was he who was being scrutinized. More murmurs of amusement rippled through the crowd, but Clint didn't smirk in triumph. He simply sat there, composed, looking straight at Keller as if waiting for something. And that only made Brandon more frustrated. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. I'm just stating facts. The world doesn't have room for outdated perspectives anymore. Today's audiences want something fresh, something progressive. Clint tilted his head slightly as if truly considering Keller's words. Then he nodded, set his glass down, and tapped a finger against the bar. Audiences want something, huh? Then tell me. What do they want? Do they want to forget the very things that built this world? Do they want to discard every value, every lesson from the past? Brandon crossed his arms, trying not to show his unease. They want stories that reflect today's world. They want to see new values, not worship the past. Clint let out a short chuckle, though there was no humor in it. You know what's funny, kid? Every young generation thinks they're rewriting history, but the truth is, you're just living in the history that someone else already wrote. The room fell silent. No one had expected that answer. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but Clint lifted a hand, stopping him. What foundation do you think you're standing on when you declare that Hollywood has changed? Clint's voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. The very movies you call outdated are the ones that built the Hollywood you're making a living in. People like me built it from nothing, and you think a few articles, a few snide remarks can erase an entire generation? Brandon swallowed hard. He was beginning to realize this wasn't an interview anymore. This was a battle, and he was running out of ammunition. A wave of heat ran down Keller's spine. He had lost control completely. There was no confident interview, no viral moment playing out the way he had envisioned. Instead, he stood before a legend, a man who didn't need to prove anything, but still had the power to dismantle anyone who dared challenge him. But Keller wasn't ready to concede. He tightened his grip on his phone, knowing that thousands of followers were waiting to witness a takedown. He cleared his throat, forcing himself back into the fight. So, according to you, the past is untouchable? No one is allowed to criticize? No one is allowed to change things? Clint raised an eyebrow, as if Keller had just said something particularly foolish. You think criticism is new? You think Hollywood has never changed? You think I haven't seen plenty of guys like you come and go, leaving no trace behind? Keller's mouth opened slightly, but Clint didn't give him a chance to speak. The old gunslinger took a slow sip of his drink, then set it down, his voice lowering. You want to change the world, but all you know how to do is tear things down. You want to teach people a lesson, but you haven't learned a damn thing yourself. Tell me, have you created anything worth remembering? A film? A story? A character that people will carry with them? Keller froze. He had no answer. There was no longer laughter in the room, only a heavy silence. The silence of a man who had just realized he had lost. And worse, he didn't even know when the battle had been decided. Brandon Keller clenched his phone tighter, but now the screen only reflected his own face, one without confidence, without smugness. He had lost the fight long before he even realized it had begun. There was no sharp comeback, no clever retort that could salvage this moment. Clint Eastwood still held that unshaken, piercing gaze, but he didn't press further. He simply took another sip of his drink, unfazed. To him, this had never been a threat, just a minor distraction in an otherwise uneventful evening. Desperate to regain control, Keller let out a dry, forced laugh, a last-ditch effort to mask his embarrassment. "You say I haven't created anything? I have thousands of followers, millions of views. My articles shape public opinion every day." Eastwood placed his glass down, tilting his head slightly as if weighing that statement. Then he shrugged. "And after you leave here, who's going to remember you?" That hit harder than any insult ever could. A shiver ran down Keller's spine. The entire room seemed to be waiting, holding its breath for his reaction. But he had nothing left to say. Because the truth was obvious. He would be just another fleeting name in the headlines, another critic who built a career tearing others down, rather than creating anything meaningful himself. Brandon Keller felt a strange sense of loss, not just because he had been humiliated in front of a crowd, but because he realized that everything he believed about himself had been an illusion. He had walked into this room thinking he was the one in control, the one with the power to judge and dismantle others, but now he was just a man standing alone, in a room full of people, looking at him with quiet pity. Clint Eastwood said nothing more, but the faint smirk on his lips spoke volumes. "You defeated yourself." Keller swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his phone as if one well-timed tweak could somehow turn the tables. But no, he knew the truth. This confrontation had ended the moment he failed to deliver a counterargument. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the kind of silence that anticipated a battle of words. It was the silence of a crowd watching a man come to terms with his own defeat. Some murmured among themselves, others shook their heads, but they all agreed on one thing. Keller had underestimated the weight of a man who had witnessed nearly a century of change, who had faced real battles, and who still stood unshaken. And the worst part? Brandon Keller was no longer the critic. He had become the perfect example of the arrogance of a generation that had never faced real adversity. Brandon Keller felt the weight of failure pressing down on him, not the kind of failure he could brush off or spin into a redemption arc with a well-crafted social media post. This was a direct blow to his ego, a public unraveling in front of the very people he had once believed he could manipulate. He stood there, frozen, as Clint Eastwood turned back to his conversation with the veteran, as if nothing had happened. No gloating, no emphasis on victory, just a man who had lived through generations and continued to do what he believed was right. And that, more than anything else, infuriated Keller. Desperate to regain control, Keller pulled out his phone, considering how he could edit this confrontation, cut and twist it into a version where he could portray himself as the victim of an outdated old man. But then, he looked around. No one cared anymore. People had returned to their drinks, their conversations, their future plans. The entire room had already moved on, as if Keller had been nothing more than a passing breeze, loud for a moment, then gone. And that was more terrifying than ridicule. He was no longer important enough to even be mocked. Brandon Keller hadn't lost because Clint Eastwood was too sharp. He had lost because he had been wrong from the very beginning. And now he had to face a truth he had never considered. He was not the one controlling the narrative. He was just a fleeting name, soon to be forgotten. With his face burning, Keller walked out of the room. Not from the heat of the chandeliers, not from the wine, but from the fury boiling inside him. His entire plan to take down Clint Eastwood, to make himself the center of attention, had backfired in the worst possible way. He hadn't just lost, he had been dismissed. The phone in his hand buzzed non-stop. Notifications flooded in, but not with the praise or support he had hoped for. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they were all exploding, but not in his favor. The video of his confrontation with Eastwood was spreading at lightning speed, but instead of being a triumphant takedown, it was a disaster. A rookie journalist tries to outwit a legend and buries himself instead. Brandon Keller thought he could take down Clint Eastwood. He lost the moment he opened his mouth. Eastwood didn't need to shout or get angry. He only needed one simple line to shut Keller down. The comments poured in, and each one sliced through Keller's pride. He tried clicking on a few posts to respond, but even those who had once supported him were starting to distance themselves. Worse, his colleagues, the very ones who had praised him as a bold new voice, were silent. Not a single one defended him. They didn't want to be associated with his failure. He had become radioactive. In the world of media, mistakes could be forgiven, but public humiliation? That was a death sentence. He hadn't just lost credibility, he had lost himself. Standing in the shadows of the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, Keller looked back at the event he had just been exiled from. Inside, Clint Eastwood remained unfazed, unbothered by the aftermath of what had just unfolded. He didn't need to tweet, to post, to defend himself, because the world was already speaking for him. Brandon Keller swallowed down his anger and walked away, unnoticed. No more laughter, no more whispers. Because he had become the worst thing a man in media could ever be, irrelevant. The confrontation between Clint Eastwood and Brandon Keller is a powerful lesson on humility, respect, and self-awareness in an era dominated by quick judgments and social media narratives. In today's world, many people seek attention by tearing others down rather than building something meaningful. Keller's downfall was not due to lack of intelligence, but rather his arrogance and belief that he could manipulate a situation for personal gain. One key takeaway from this story is the importance of respecting experience and wisdom. Clint Eastwood didn't need to raise his voice or get defensive. He allowed his presence, confidence, and lived experience to speak for itself. This teaches us that true strength doesn't come from proving others wrong, but from knowing who you are and standing firm in your values. Another important lesson is that attempting to control public perception through manipulation can backfire. Keller believed he could shape the narrative, but in the end, authenticity prevailed. In our daily lives, we should strive for genuine interactions and thoughtful conversations rather than seeking to win at the expense of others. True influence isn't about loud declarations, it's about the legacy we leave through our actions and integrity.